Thank you for joining us. Today we're talking to you about the development of the Crescent Bay showcase experiences. We're going to walk you through the why, the narrative of how they evolved, and share with you some of the lessons we've learned along the way. Bonus, you'll also get to see some of the unshipped work sacrificed in the name of good VR.
Hey everyone, I'm Vognsen. I'm the engineering lead on the content team in Seattle, along with Kenneth. Nowadays, our team has several software engineers, but about a year ago, when we first started building these experiences, I was the only engineer. So I ended up getting pretty heavily involved in everything we built, not just from a technical perspective, but sometimes from a creative perspective as well. So I hope we can share all of that with you guys today.
Cool. And I am Kenneth Scott, 3D art director for Oculus. I built the content team who created the Crescent demo experiences. I built a few of them myself, and I led the creative side of their execution. The Crescent Bay demo content had a lot of aspirations, but at the core of it, evangelized VR. It was built as a conversion tool. The intent was to create a broad and varied group of experiences that would excite enthusiasts and developers alike. Build the proof that VR is the next big playground for creative expression. Unless you're making a lightsaber or a flying car, this is the closest thing to science fiction you could be doing right now. We wanted folks from film to take off the headset and feel gross and icky about having to go back to their flat screen medium. We wanted game developers to peel off the rift with their skulls still humming about this new frontier. So this talk makes the assumption you've had opportunity to experience the Crescent Bay Showcase content. There's no adequate way to paint a picture of the VR experience outside of VR, but still be warned, spoilers be ahead.
So when we set out to build these demos, Oculus as a company was really focused on what we called comfort. Now the word comfort is a little ambiguous. When we use it, mean something fairly specific. So when you look at the content we build for Crescent Bay, you have a T-Rex roaring in your face, and you'll find yourself standing on the ledge of a skyscraper. And to most people, that's maybe not the most comfortable thing in the world. But that's not necessarily what we mean by comfort. Typically, we mean something fairly specific, which is the absence of simulation sickness. And while that's something that entails a lot of kind of technical components, the whole pipeline from the headset down to the operating system and the drivers, when we're talking about content creation, we sort of had two touchstones that we chose to adhere to when we built these demos. The first was 90 hertz frame rate, no exceptions. Especially a year ago, the SDK was in an earlier state, and if you dropped a frame in the engine, you got some jitter. I think everyone probably tried that if they were developing back then. Nowadays, we have a little more leeway with Q ahead in the latest SDK version, but back then, it was a hard requirement. We had to never drop frames, 90 hertz, no exceptions. The other requirement we imposed upon ourselves was to have no virtual locomotion. So what that means is anytime the virtual camera moves through the world, it always does so completely proportionate to your real-life head movements. So no roller coasters or anything crazy like that. It's a standing experience, so you can obviously move around, and I think it was around a 4x4 mat area, but you were always complete control of the virtual camera.
Oculus Rex. So while fitting the myriad of experiences together, we were deliberate about crafting the user experience around scaling VR intensity. We intended to start the user out gently and turn up the heat across the whole experience. That makes a dinosaur encounter a poor starting point, but it makes sense to start our discussion here, as this was the first experience built for Crescent Bay. It ended up being our finale experience and started simply out as a desire to meet a dinosaur. These early days had some pretty big unanswered questions about quality VR and strong sense of presence. What can you actually achieve at 90 frames per second? Didn't know. Are normal maps still effective or hurt presence? It made sense to create something that drove to those answers, but also demonstrated why this new frontier was so cool. So making something with a little light narrative was a great forcing function. Storyboards became a priceless communication tool in the early days, as we had no animators and had to enlist external help. Wanda. Yes, Oculus's first character was a dinosaur and a lady. Started in ZBrush, and she ended up weighing in at a cantankerous 9 million polygons. As her role was to be intimidating, we opted for a more filmic monster/creature look. This prompted us to dub her Oculus Rex rather than T-Rex, having some concern that dinosaur purists would struggle with it otherwise, or worse, make fun of me online. Knowing we wanted her to get close to the viewer, we spent an inordinate amount of detail on her face. She ended up going through 2 major topologies as we better understood our performance constraints. Her very conservative 14K topology in the early days did not hold up very well up close, and that was very important to her believability. Rah, we have no audio. I'm so sorry, Tom. Tom's our audio director. She finally debuted at a very generous 40K. And we learned a lot. Yay, normal maps work very well on dynamic object, but it pays to let geometry carry more weight when possible. End of sentence. A lot of traditional content creation paradigms still apply. Animation works, but slower is better. Tearing or strobing tends to hurt presence and can also cause a lot of discomfort. And the real big and sort of important takeaway, VR is an emotional multiplier. You can't simply replicate a film or game experience without strong emotional repercussions. It was typical to see people, when viewing this particular experience, actually end up shrinking to the floor as she passed over. So be gentle. Cool. Submarine. Our first experience intended to be a soft exploration on confinement. As the intro environment and potentially someone's very first experience in VR, we opted for something very static and very high fidelity, just to ease the viewer in. So we wanted the user to explore the smaller environment, take a few steps, feel compelled to duck, really feel the credibility of the space. Knowing that VR offers the user a much stronger ability to pick up on volume, we opted to overrepresent data in geometry. Just bask in this for a moment, because it's some amazing modeling. Cool. The space hit a really strong sense of authenticity, and you felt there. The content itself brought a sense of relief to those of us who had doubts that high fidelity art could even happen in VR. One adorable and surprising takeaway, the experience ended up being very personal and unique to each user. Paul Pepera, the 6'4" badass who built this experience, has a very different sense of confinement in here than, say, somebody of my verticality has.
All right.
Go, sir.
So let's talk about polyforest. In the original demo sequence, you leave Submarine that Kenneth just talked about, and suddenly you're in this amazing forest. It's almost the polar opposite of Submarine. It's cartoony, stylized. It doesn't have a lot of geometric or shading detail, but it's extremely expansive. It's a large open world, the way you might find it in an open world RPG. One other thing we wanted to do was to really explore geometric form in the absence of shading. And kind of to get that look before we actually built the 3D environment, we chose to do concept art for this one, as we did for many others. And so here you see the concept art, and here is the in-game version. And you can see they match up quite closely. One huge takeaway from this, and something we really wanted to convey, is that presence does not equate to photorealism in the superficial sense. I think it's easy to take the definition of presence and think it means to feel like the real world in every respect. But if anything, you can make the argument that an experience like this one, with its very stylized look, is actually a greater purveyor of presence than certain hyper-photorealistic spaces that maybe push the boundaries of the uncanny valley. And if you explore how we use shading here, you'll find that it's almost completely in absence. So there's not even smooth shading. This is almost like Star Fox SNES era kind of geometric complexity and shading, flat shaded, simple colors, no normal maps, no PBR, nothing of that sort. But it worked really, really well. And I think we succeeded very well in conveying the sense of a sort of expansive space that you just wanted to hang out in. More than any other demo, I really saw people get into this and sit down and just sort of hang out by the campfire. And afterwards, when they came out of the demo, they would often tell you that they kind of wished that they could have just sat there forever, but unfortunately, the demo is on a timer. One other thing that this thing conveys is that to build high-end VR in a subjective sense does not mean you have to push the boundaries of sort of GPU shading and geometric complexity. You can build an experience at this level of fidelity, and almost all users will be able to enjoy it, even with lower-end hardware. Here you see sort of a screenshot of the Vista. One thing that we struggled with occasionally in building experiences in VR was conveying distance in a credible way. it's very easy when things recede into the distance for you to lose parallax, which is one of the most significant effects in VR. And so in order to really sell the expansiveness of this space, you can see that we used sort of same scale shapes replicated into the distance to signify perspective foreshortening. And we had sort of an over-exaggerated distance fog to also sell that distance.
Moon alien. We had great success with experience it had like simple narratives, and already having done a T-Rex, it made sense to walk through all the 80s and 90s Spielbergisms, hence the moon alien. The core goal was simple: experience the presence of something else in VR. The backdrop narrative was simple as well. You're an alien, no sorry, you're on an alien planet and you're not welcome. The creature tries to first contact you, mumbling in his own language while invading your personal space. This was initially pitched as a RTS experience. The core of it was social interaction, and the first step to its success was nailing the creature performance. That turned out to be the thing we cared about the most, so everything else just got carved away. Knowing we needed to spend most of our resources, especially dynamic lighting and self-shadowing, on our alien actor, keeping the environment super lean and low cost was really important. I opted to be a little paranoid, yes, but I rendered everything offline in Modo, shaders, lighting, shaders, shadows, were all baked into a single texture. The only real-time surface in this scene is actually the small ground surface you're standing on. To illustrate, another really great advantage to completely pre-rendering everything into geometry is you get a lot of flexibility to fix in post. The post-processing, the color tuning, the hot orange yellow rim lighting was all painted in hand in Photoshop. And here's our actor. His source mesh, sculpted in ZBrush, weighed in about 8 million polygons, and he baked nicely to about 30K. Being alien kept us safe from the usual pitfalls of facial performance and safely the hell away of the uncanny valley. He's very relatable, but unusual enough that he can actually survive the user's close scrutiny. So there's a magical moment during this experience when, as you just saw, when the alien waves at the user. It's a canned, pre-authored event, but it's always kind of a fun moment, especially if you're actually watching somebody else, because very frequently they will actually wave back. It's pretty cool. Let me suffer a little humiliation for a sec here. This is a year ago and 20 pounds, so. This is Canon VR. We were largely a distributed team in the early days, so it was typical to work through character performance much like that.
All right. I'm just going to say a few things about sort of the animation and the tech that went into the alien. So we knew we really wanted a creature that felt credible. We knew we wanted it to feel alive and like it was reacting to you. But we did have limited resources. So step one was kind of placing the alien kind of at the edge of your personal space, allowing you to take a step towards it into its personal space. But we knew that, and I think we observed in the early kind of tests, that if you did that and it just played back its canned animation loop, it really broke the illusion of life, because it would just stand there and do whatever it was doing without sensing your presence. So one thing we did was, instead of doing something extremely procedural from the ground up, because we had an offsite animator, we ended up basically taking sort of the final animation clip that he produced, which was very good, and then trying to sort of superimpose just enough proceduralism in order to make it credible and reactive. And so the route we took was to basically have 3 single bone IK controllers, one on the neck and one for each eyeball, and they would track you in real time depending on your headset position. Now, the one gotcha there is, as you'll remember from the animation you just saw, in parts of the animation clip, is really performance oriented. Like the alien will wave at you, or it will even like lean back in sort of disgust. And if the alien is sort of rigidly head tracking you at those moments, it will be very weird and robotic. So the approach we took was to essentially author by hand a blend curve that controlled the influence of the head tracking throughout the different parts of the animation. So for example, in the more idle sections of the animation, the IK head tracking may be turned on to like 90%, so it's almost completely tracking you throughout its performance. But then when it gets to some of the more distinctive moments, like waving or leaning back, the head tracking gets turned down to say 10 to 20%, so that it's mostly driven by the created, crafted performance, and the head tracking is just sort of like a side note. But what we found, sort of to our surprise and delight, is that even having a little bit of head tracking, say at the 10 to 20% level at all times, created this sense of reactivity that was otherwise lacking. So just having it kind of move in response to your movement, even if it doesn't track you, was really great at kind of conveying the sense of it reacting to your presence rather than just standing there executing a pre-canned performance. Oh, I guess this didn't autoplay. So here you see some examples of, OK, these are some blend shapes that are just sort of being exercised. We ended up using blend shapes for all the facial animation except for just like a jawbone. So almost all of this was like blend shapes, morph targets, whatever you want to call it. All right. Let's just wait for that to finish.
It's worth watching twice.
All right, there we go.
Thank you. There he is in all his glory. The result was strong, and we had a pretty high-end look considering the constraints. People came away feeling that they weren't alone in the headset, and that something real had invaded their personal space. Why I didn't call this this experience invasion is a mystery to me. Audiobots. Audiobot was conceived to showcase our new 3D audio SDK. It started simply enough as an industrial robot holding sound items that it would spin around your head. This is its humble beginnings, a quick 5-minute concept piece. The team at the time had a full plate when the time this request came in. So a lot of this early development actually happened externally. We reached out to a film and game concept artist, Gavril Klimov, who specializes in cool technical and industrial design. Here's some of the very exciting and awesome work he did for us. So just hold in the slide and enjoy for a second. Cool. But there's a lot of buts here. There was a great opportunity to bite off a little bit more and make the robot a fully realized character. We wanted to make him more personified and opted to push his behavior away from robotic and towards curious puppy dog. We rapidly went back to the drawing board and came up with this. Something that we know could act and hit the Luxo Junior beats we wanted. Bonus orc in the corner. Storyboarding was a key part of our communication, with offsite animation as well as a great test bed to iterate on narrative. So more storyboarding. When the dust settled, we had created a really charming character piece, but unfortunately at the expense of the true intent. The Audiobots were so strongly interesting, the user followed them with their eyes and took their ears with them. Also, the desire to exploit the full 360 space also caused a few headaches. People would lose the actors as they circled around them, and actually in some rare circumstances, they would pull a full 360 and actually get tangled up in the cords. So all in all, it was still a really quality experience. We learned a lot, and our follow-up audio piece was a lot more successful. Quick and a special thanks to the folks at Epic who came in at the 0 hour and helped us land the effects. Mirror Room.
So Mirror Room is an exploration on self-identification. I think almost of all the demos we built, it's the one that went through the most painstaking iteration. Here you see on the left the very, very humble beginnings of it. It started out as just this idea of how do you represent yourself in VR, when you're in VR, in the absence of hand tracking or body tracking. In the absence of those things, all you have is the headset. So the obvious way of representing yourself is through a mirror reflection. And this is what you see here on the left. We went with a very sort of prototypey look with a gross geometric shape for your head, spheres for eyes, and so on. But already in this simple version, it actually felt convincing. It felt like it was a reflection of you. It was just sufficiently abstract that it didn't feel like someone else. It was just kind of vague and universal. Another exploration is here on the right, where we took a balloon and we had a physically simulated string hanging from the bottom. And so as you would shake your head side to side, the cord would dangle underneath. And it would sort of create a sense of delight and engagement with the experience. And we really wanted to also incorporate that in what we built. But the question was, how did we take these sort of early prototypey exploratory demos and make them into something that would fit in with the rest of the Crescent Bay experiences? So this is what we ended up with as a concept for the environment, which was a Victorian-style dining room that sort of calls to mind Alice in Wonderland. And here it is in Engine. What you don't see, unfortunately, in this screenshot is the avatar head representation we ended up with, which was a Venetian mask, something that was sort of sufficiently universal and androgynous with smooth facial features that were neither male nor female that would let you identify with it very easily. One issue we ran into with this and a few other environments, but I think most strongly with this one, is something you can kind of see in the mirror, actually, which is look at that room behind you as you're in the experience. It's incredibly detailed. We spent a huge amount of effort building out all the props, the teapots, the saucers, the furniture, all these props. And it was unfortunately a little too common to see people, rather than kind of engage with the reflection the way we wanted, to say, hey, what's that behind me? And they would just do a full 180, and they would spend all their time just kind of exploring the tea set. Not really what we wanted.
I've seen people actually go down on their hands and knees and look under the table. It was,
yeah, that was, I think,
it was really cool, actually, but oops.
So like props to the environment artists, but didn't quite get across what we wanted. So it did definitely teach us, along with some of our other experiences, how you have to, especially in these experiences we built that are very focused on one kind of subjective emotion or VR kind of conceit, that sometimes building out too much artistic detail can distract the focus. So that's definitely something we took away from this. So in the original OC1 demo, almost exactly a year ago, that most of you might have seen, we just had one head representation, which was this Venetian mask. And it actually had some great features. For example, it had this inlaid gold that would kind of encourage you to look around to see the light bounce off of it differently. But after internal discussions, we felt that we really wanted to do more exploration around kind of different representations of people's heads. And I think throughout all of this, the overarching issue was where you land on the abstract versus concrete side of things. So for example, it might naively seem that the most convincing way of showing yourself in VR is to have a human-like face, like a 3D scan maybe, with every little pore in your skin and beard on your face cleverly conveyed. But I think it's maybe with a little bit of thought pretty clear why that's not so great. So for example, imagine I wake up in the morning and I go to the bathroom and I look in the mirror, and instead of my face, it's Kenneth's face. That's what it often feels like if you go too high fidelity, too high detail on avatar representation. So if you go very concrete with avatar heads in VR, you really need to nail it all the way. There's no halfway measures. So instead of going that route, we chose to back to something more abstract, more in line with the Venetian mask, but also more diverse. And here you see some concepts of the many things we explored. A balloon, a candle, a sort of a sunflower. Most of these were built into 3D versions, and I think about 5 ended up shipping for the CES iteration. One thing we found consistently is that the heads that had some sort of dynamic interactive element, like the balloon string that I mentioned before, or the flickering candle you see there, or the sunflower had this sort of two-piece construction where one would kind of rotate of its own volition. All these sort of dynamic interactive heads were way more engaging. Even in experiences that were really just about the self-identification, having something that kind of engaged you to wave around and get really into it was very cool. All right.
Cool. Vertigo. Vertigo's focus was on the intense sensation of being at a precarious height. While this ended up being one of our most powerful experiences, the path was surprisingly difficult. Nope. Cool. It sounds like it should be a straightforward matter of just putting someone at the edge of a very high cliff, but that actually was not the case. The more narrative elements and visual complexity we layered on In this case, a absolutely gorgeous Gothic cityscape. The more muted the sensation became. Hover on this for a bit because it's beautiful. Doesn't get enough airtime. For those of you who've ridden on a large mountain gondola or giant Ferris wheel, will observe like how much more unnerving it is when it passes by the towers. Having relatable and predictable elements that help build spatial comprehension was the aha moment that actually got us there. This is Vertigo's humble beginnings. As mentioned, the simple form of purity of focus was difficult to return to. Earlier versions of Vertigo had strong horizontal interest and points of interest everywhere. It was a lot to look at. It was super cool. But we really needed to drive focus to the precipice. Simply relighting the scene helped bring the focus back to where it needed to be. The addition of particles and near-plane elements helped the fear factor by exaggerating parallax. We also had the space designed on a plank of sorts, and having the ability to see the windows repeat clearly down to the ground as you stepped over the edge was a lot more powerful. We also had rails thinking that would give near-plane elements to help exaggerate parallax, but it also gave the user a sense of security and would become dangerous when someone would get weak-kneed and actually reach for it.
All right. So here you see the concept for the experience we call Paper Town. The power of scale is a recurring motif in VR. You see it in some of our earlier experience that Kenneth has talked about, like the T-Rex and Vertigo. But we just knew we wanted something in our demo set with miniature scale. We wanted this to feel like not just a miniature set, but something that was a fully functioning tabletop world, overflowing with fine detail and really engaging dynamics. So we ended up with the concept of a papercraft cutout town with little paper people kind of milling about, going about their daily lives. The intention of the non-photorealistic style we used here was also to sort of hedge our bets on performance. Because in the early days when we started building all of these experiences, we were still not 100% sure if we could hit the super high bar for visual fidelity. So we chose to go a little more conservative. So it's somewhat funny that in hindsight, this one actually turned out to be the biggest perf headache of all of them, because it had so many dynamic objects that all wanted to have dynamic shadows in order to really sell the spatial relationships. So lesson learned. Here you see two concepts of the male and female character in Paper Town. As a fun fact, they're named Clint and Brandy after the default avatars in Neil Stephenson's metaverse. And here's the whole thing running in engine. If you place the concept and the in-engine screenshot side by side, you'll see how closely they match. Yeah, it might be, when you see them here, you can kind of tell the difference, but otherwise it might be a little bit hard to pick it out of a lineup. One thing that I find particularly striking about this demo is that when I talked to game developers who had just come out of all our demos, this was the one that really kind of pushed their imagination in a professional way. So they might be really blown away by the T-Rex or the alien on just a sort of subjective level, but with their kind of professional hats on, this was the one that really got their juices flowing. And I think the reason is, as a game developer, when you see this, you immediately say, okay, I know how I can build SimCity or Rome Total War or any games like that. It's almost a complete blueprint for building that sort of game experience. And in fact, you can take this basic template and you can expand it far beyond that if you combine the miniature scale with viewpoint teleporting, which is sort of an emerging standard in VR game design. And if you haven't experienced it, the way I would kind of convey why it's so powerful for game design is that you can move across a very large virtual space with a small amount of physical movement. So for example, in Paper Town, if I lean in to the house on your right, I can peer all the way through to the window and see a little paper guy doing jumping jacks. But then just with a little bit of swaying to my other side, I can actually get to the other side of town and peer in through a window there. So you basically have the ability to navigate a very large virtual space with a small amount of physical movement. And that amplification of scale is super, super powerful for game design.
There have been a lot of corpses on the path to good VR. So this slide is a little celebration to the work for whatever reason took a bullet. I affectionately call this the fail slide. I say that with fondness. Failure is the best teacher you'll ever know. I'm not going to walk you through all the cold work, but I will focus on a few things that either had some interesting takeaways or some art that would otherwise see the light of day. So this section is as much for us as it is for you. Let's look at cool things. Cool. So a solar system was a good place to play with scale. This felt fantastic, but it was difficult to get the sun's surface to read well at that scale. The surface texture itself alluded to so much dimension, but you have such an extraordinary ability to judge depth in VR that it was very unconvincing. So cut. So we wanted something that could allude to the potential that VR could offer for data visualization. Almost every sci-fi film of our generation has their UI hanging in space. It's actually very powerful in VR. We had the luck to know a very talented gentleman by the name of Peter Boehm, who had actually built a very attractive but non-real-time digital map. So a few emails later, and thanks to Unreal, I was standing in it a few hours later. So we had established a floor plane for a solid foot registration, and the environment itself actually kind of hung around your waist. And it was really cool, actually, just being able to kind of wade through the environment itself. But so much of our vernacular around strong VR experiences had changed, and with neither a loose or light narrative or some light degree of agency or interaction, the experience never hit a high note. So cut. So a lot of our strongest experiences play with scale. And the idea of being at the business end of an electron microscope was actually really compelling. It was really impactful. We built this initially as a rough proof of concept. We very much wanted the full suite of demos to be very stylistically diverse, and this was a good test bed to look dev macro photography. Even in its unanimated state, the challenge quickly became people's comfort levels in invasion of space. This thing was really scary. It was creeping people out more than it was actually giving them a quality VR experience. So as much as we enjoyed the intensity, VR is an emotional multiplier. We thought it better just to remove it. People's first experience in VR should be impactful and visceral, but it should be pleasant. So cut. Now, other neat thing, the microbes themselves did some magic for the experience. Being the same size, they really helped build spatial comprehension, and the drifting motion prompted a lot of viewers to actually reach out and try to touch them. It's cool to watch. So we now actually place dust motes and particles in our near plane for all of our experiences to help exaggerate parallax. But cut. Starfall. Just bask in the gorgeous concept for a second. So we learned so much from our Vertigo experience. We felt we had the momentum to go round two, fight. And let's see if we could actually make the experience even more intense. It was also an opportunity to wrestle with effects in VR. And effects was a territory that we really needed to understand better. Some Gabriel Garza sweetness. So anytime we undertook anything that had some unfolding narrative, we quickly build our understanding through storyboards. It's just a good habit to have. Now, the real strength of VR is being able to place the viewer in extraordinary places. Experience things in a visceral way impossible in other mediums. We placed you on the precarious edge of an indoor satellite launch impossibly close to the launch path. Much excite. We chose not to pursue it further as it did incite feelings of dread. So much of the rocket also took up most of your view as it passed by, and the optical flow actually caused a lot of discomfort too. So cut. Bye. Cool. So in furthering our learning, we needed to tackle an experience with locomotion. We knew some of what we need to happen to avoid simulation sickness, but we really needed to find out for ourselves what other dragons lay at the edge of the map. Knowing we wanted to do some tiny level of storytelling, this started actually as a fantastic journey-like experience. You were floating through a human body. Not pictured here, though. So, iteration brought us to the deep sea. Managing optical flow is very important, especially when you have particles and elements that may give you a sense of movement inconsistent with what your body is expecting. So, to solve, we plan to build in elements to help in the way of a cockpit, giving the eye something to anchor on. This is actually where we landed. It had a lot of the sort of open acreage. This is some of the fictional development of the craft itself. The planned experience was a slow, soothing migration through a beautiful underwater scene. to be punctuated by a final gulp of a giant sea creature. So we'd fade to black, maybe there'd be a burp, done. Despite having to shelve this in favor of other Oculus initiatives, we gleaned a lot from the work we did, particularly around motion versus comfort. Having particles, be they bubbles or fish, that strongly suggest a directional flow can be nauseating. Adding elements like the cockpit that supersede its impact can help reground you. So VR enthusiasts may remember Tuscany. We briefly toyed with the idea of updating it and stood up some concept art around a few ideas. We wanted some gentle interaction, and we had planned to use head tracking to drive butterflies to follow you and land where the viewer looked. The art was gorgeous, but we never found that hook to get us very excited about it. You know, and the world doesn't need another 3D Angkor Wat, so cut. Cool.
All right. So this is the super nerdy section. I hope if any of you are optimizing performance for content, like even if you're sort of a tech artist, and especially if you're a rendering engineer or just any kind of engineer, that there'll be something useful for you to take away from kind of our experience building these things over the last year or so. So just to set the stage, I think everyone knows that VR rendering isn't cheap, but I just wanted to kind of set the stage a little more quantitatively with some numbers. So if you look at an absolute high-end console game nowadays, it's probably rendering at 1080p, and if you're really, really, really lucky, it's running at 60 hertz, but probably not. But even at the high end of that, you're looking at 124 million pixels per second being pushed. But for comparison, Crescent Bay running at 90 hertz is pushing around 400 million pixels per second. So that's a fairly large gap. But it's actually worse than that, because we also have this hard requirement of low latency. Now, unfortunately, the way GPU architecture has been designed since, I would say, the inception, is to sacrifice latency for more throughput by buffering up everything in a deep pipeline and implicitly parallelizing everything. And if you force the GPU to sync to the CPU for lower latency, you unfortunately give up some performance just in the back of that. So that's another issue. And finally, this is not a sort of permanent restriction, but it's certainly true that for current engines and APIs, you're typically looking at twice the number of draw calls because you're drawing the whole world from point of view of both eyes. So really, as a conceptual kind of help, when you think 90 frames a second, you're really doing the equivalent of 120 draw calls. So if you're limited on the CPU by draw calls, you're extra limited now with VR. So definitely something you have to think about as you're building out content and looking at optimization. So just some profiling hints, how we generally went about figuring out what was going on with our performance. In UE4, your number one go-to is the console command profile GPU. It will do a frame capture, and it will do a sort of a tree breakdown of where the time is going. So it will tell you if you're spending time on shadows, on lighting, on decals. It's really great. I found if you think you have something turned on, like screen space ambient occlusion, it will tell you, hey, you're spending a lot of time on this, and you're like, wow, I thought I turned that off. But it's really great for catching those sort of gotchas as well. And beyond UE4, because you have a lot of CPU, GPU syncing, more so than you're probably used to if you're a rendering guy, the GPU view tool from Microsoft is great for doing traces and kind of letting you see the whole application to driver stack and where the buffering is happening and where you're syncing too much. Finally, typically you might use IHV tools like Nsight, but I've found that they're not always completely robust for VR development. But what you can do is you can try to emulate the VR workload running in a non-VR mode and try to get at least some data. But unfortunately, right now, my experience is these don't work great. In all our experiences, the number one recurring issue with performance was always shadow maps, dynamic shadow maps. And really not a huge surprise, I guess. Like even in non-VR games, this is often a big issue. But even more so than we're used to, we have to really pre-bake as much as possible in order to get back some performance. And even in these experiences you saw here, which are realistically much more constrained and focused than most games, for example, we ended up only using at most one dynamic shadowcaster per scene. And frankly, if you're going much wider than a small scene like this into something more like a full game, you may even have to use 0 dynamic shadowcasters. And if you do that, then you have to somehow make up the lost ground in other ways. And something we've experimented with is, first off, when you have a character walking around a scene, one thing that shadows do, dynamic shadows that is sell the sort of connection and contact between the character and the environment. And that's actually something you can do with much cheaper techniques like blob shadows. And the other thing that dynamic shadows typically used for is you have something like a character like me on stage right now. If I wasn't completely blasted by the light, you'd be able to see, the shadow of my head on the shoulders and my upper arm on my lower arm and stuff like that. And you can actually approximate those sort of effects using, one thing we've experimented with is analytic SDF self-shadows, where basically you approximate the limbs, the gross limbs, like the parts of the arm and maybe the head and the shoulders, by geometric primitives like spheres and capsules, and then you do analytic ray tracing in your pixel shader in order to get sort of soft shadows based on that rough approximate geometric model. So between those two, you can replicate a lot of the effects of dynamic shadows in a much cheaper and more constrained way. Another thing, this is something I've seen in a lot of our own content before it sort of had a perf pass, but also in a lot of third-party content. Screen space effects like motion blur and depth of field are really, really expensive because of all the pixels we're pushing. But more importantly, they just don't look good in VR. So just turn them off. Using the GPU profile command I mentioned earlier is really great for catching sort of stray screen space effects you thought weren't running but are. Beyond that, a lot of the general perf advice is kind of what you'd expect. You really want to limit the number of dynamic lights and their radius of influence. And this is true even for dynamic lights that don't cast shadows. And because of this 2x draw call thing we're dealing with most of the time in VR, you even more so than normal want to really pre-batch static assets so you can send them over to the GPU in one draw call. That specific thing may get better over time as D3D12 and Vulkan and other next-gen rendering APIs make that cheaper. And also, vertex count is still important. I think over the last 10 years, the focus has moved so much to shading that people sometimes get a little cavalier about vertex count. But you're really pushing 120 frames worth of vertices nowadays, and it's really an issue. Like, we ran into this with a lot of our, especially I would say environments, where they ended up being way higher res than they needed to be, and it really does cost a lot. And finally, for general UE4 sort of rendering performance advice, I suggest you go back to the OC1 talk by Epic from last year. UE4 has definitely evolved a lot since, but there's still a lot of stuff there that holds true now. So one other thing we've kind of worked on over the last year is anti-aliasing. UE4 by default uses a deferred renderer, which means that you can't use MSAA. So you have to use techniques like temporal AA or fast approximate AA. Unfortunately, neither is ideal. TAA relies on a sort of thresholding technique where it only averages pixels together that haven't moved since the last frame. It's imperfect, and in order to do that thresholding, it needs to render a velocity buffer for dynamic objects. So that's just more pixel-related cost you have to lay down for an already taxed GPU. And TAA also tends to overblur everything, so if you want to have a lot of detail in your texture maps, once TAA gets a hold of them, it does tend to overblur it. And there's sort of, the anti-aliasing issues are partly a side effect of the deferred rendering. But there's actually other issues with the deferred as well, with VR rendering specifically. And the big one is that the kind of reason for existence for deferred rendering, at least traditionally, is the idea that you paid a large upfront cost to kind of lay down the G buffer, and then ideally you draw a bunch of small footprint dynamic lights that sort of help amortize the cost that you paid up front. But unfortunately, we haven't been able to really hit that number of dynamic lights that pay off the initial fixed costs. So deferred, in our experience at least for the things we've made, has not been the right trade-off. But unfortunately, it's the only thing that comes built in UE4. And as I mentioned earlier, you can't use MSAA with deferred. So for a long time, we wanted to look into maybe writing our own deferred forward renderer to replace the deferred one in UE4. But it was pretty daunting. So for a long time, we just put it in the backlog. But about a month ago, we had an engineer start working on this, and we've already made extremely fast progress. So what we did is we started with UE4's existing mobile renderer, which is a forward renderer, which has very low shading fidelity. It doesn't support most of the features we need, but it kind of showed us a basic roadmap for how to write a forward renderer. And then we just sort of went through all the missing features and fidelity gaps and just kind of filled them one by one. And now we're extremely close to having feature parity and quality parity with the PC deferred renderer. And for at least our current project, and this is by no means universal, but for our current project, we're seeing twice the GPU load, which is a very, very big improvement. And from that, you get gorgeous MSAA, which is really beautiful. It really makes all those edges beautiful rather than jagged or blurred out. It has a huge improvement to the look of everything. But we still have a bunch of open questions with this forward renderer. One of them is, hey, MSAA only really addresses geometric aliasing, like edge anti-aliasing. But what about shading aliasing? For example, if you have normal maps that are fairly high frequency and you have specular, then one thing you'll see is they will sparkle as you move the camera. And it's especially bad in VR because your head tends to move a little bit all the time in VR, and so you tend to really pick up on that sort of normal map sparkling. In TAA, it just sort of handles it automatically through its kind of filtering approach. But for MSAA, you need something additional to handle it. And we've kind of thought of two approaches. We haven't implemented them yet, so this is speculative. But we've thought of doing TAA on top of this, using only the camera velocity, which is way cheaper than rendering the velocity buffer. And a more classic technique is Toxvic-style normal MIP maps, where basically you pre-filter the normal maps to figure out where there's kind of a large derivative, and then you do a sort of pre-filtered index based on the spread of the normal map dispersion. And finally, there's sort of a question of what we do with this renderer we've written. Ideally, we'd want to share it with other people once it's more mature. And we might look into getting Epic to integrate it upstream or sharing it to developers in some other way, but right now that's TBD. All right.
Cool. Well, hey, thank you so much. So you go ahead.
No, so if anyone wants to ask questions, there is a microphone all the way up at the top, and that way everyone else can hear you.
Cool. Good job. Good job. You can't mute it.
How you doing? I had a question about UE4 and alpha and transparency and effects in general. Like we've had a hard time keeping performance up with using alpha and transparency. Has that helped using the forward renderer, or is that still an issue for you guys?
I mean, so there's kind of classic issues with transparency, with deferred rendering, which is that you kind of, in deferred, you lay down all of the geometric and material properties in one pass. And so unless you're using some sort of order-independent transparency algorithm, which UE4 doesn't have, you can only sort of have one layer. So by default, the way UE4 with its deferred renderer does transparent objects is it basically does forward rendering just for the transparent objects in a final pass. And that means it has a very kind of reduced fidelity on its shading model for transparent objects. As for things like particles, I mean, they're generally just very expensive, even not in VR. So if you're talking about kind of cost for overdraw for particles, I don't really have a great answer. It really is just something you have to be super mindful of. As much as possible in the further explorations and sort of VFX we've done in UE4, we've tried to not rely on effects that require kind of heavy stacking up of particles. But I mean, it is expensive.
I was looking at the rocket demo and I was like, where'd you make all the effects for that look good?
Yeah, I mean, there are a bunch of concerns with making the rocket demo the way it was intended, but
I had faith, though.
I mean, there are definitely things you can do. Like, for example, I don't know if you've seen Showdown, which is Epic's demo from last year. They actually have a sort of geometric representation of a lot of the heavy rocket smoke. So like something like that might be tenable in some cases.
But that's all like volumetric geometry,
right? But and that's all pre-baked, of course, the stuff they do there. But definitely, I mean, there's other general techniques one can investigate for like reducing overdraw for alpha particles. But I mean, it's basically the same problem in non-VR. It's just you have to be really careful about it. It's very expensive.
Yeah. Okay.
Cool.
Hi, yeah, I was wondering, is there going to be any plan to release these demos like when the Rift releases? That, you know, people at home can show their family, hey, look, this, that.
I think we haven't announced anything about that, so
Okay.
I don't think I can talk about that, unfortunately.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
Well, you should think about it.
Yeah,
We want it.
we will.
They're great.
Thank you.
That's a good question.
Hi, I have a very creative question. I'm wondering if you've experimented with motion through scaling. Essentially, I would love to see the Powers of 10 short film in VR.
We have, and honestly, it's still kind of the same issue. It's like your body is expecting something that's not really happening. You just get super queasy.
Okay.
Party pooper.
But go ahead and try it for yourself.
I've got a very simple question. Which of the demos were your favorite and why?
Do you want me to go first? I have fondness for a lot of them. Actually, I think the one that I would probably, in some point, if I have a few weekends, I'll probably return to is the macro photography one. We call it macromite. I think there is something about just sort of the intensity and the presence of that thing, and the particles just gave me such a strong sense of presence, like. And seeing it animated was just something that's still in the back of my head that I kind of miss out on. So that might be my answer.
All right. I'll give you kind of two answers, one from sort of a developer perspective and one from a sort of layman's perspective. From a layman's perspective, definitely my favorite was the Polyforest. And I think the reason is I'm sort of a big open world RPG guy. I really like kind of being immersed in worlds. And that one, more than anything else we built, really put me in a world that I just wanted to spend time in. So that was just a very cool feeling. And I can't wait for third-party developers to build that kind of thing for real. From a developer perspective, it was definitely Paper Town. I think the learning of the use of scale to kind of circumnavigate some of the issues with traditional VR locomotion really is something that stuck with me and something we've since explored in other ways. So that one was the one that had the most sort of, I guess, engineering-ish takeaway for me.
Yeah, Paper Town was my favorite too.
Cool. Happy to hear that.
Thank you.
Hey, you mentioned the twice draw call cost of doing the eye rendering, but then you hinted at a technique that might make that not necessary.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's different things you can do, and I'm sort of a dilettante when it comes to rendering, so don't take everything I say on this for gospel. But I think, you can imagine it this way. There's generally no reason to say vertex shade everything because all the frame data, all the uniform data is generally the same for the two eyes. So ideally what you want is sort of like, if you imagine the GPU pipeline, you kind of want all the geometry to go through the first part of the pipeline and then only really diverge when they get to the camera transforms, which is where there's one perspective transform for the left eye and one for the right eye. And so there's basically, I think the newer APIs have better ways of kind of controlling the flow of the data through the pipeline. And I think even nowadays, you probably could do it if you use compute shaders, but I think people aren't. But you can imagine doing compute shaders for the vertex shading part, or even using vertex shaders with stream out, and then kind of circling them back in for sort of a simple no-op vertex shader that just does the attribute forwarding or something like that. So there's definitely things you can do, but a lot of the existing engines are not VR-centric. They're kind of, they have VR grafted onto them, so a lot of these techniques require so huge changes that they just haven't made it in.
Thank you.
Anyone else? Light is really bright. So.
That's right. I'm wondering if you've done any work with Gear VR using the forward rendering in UE4?
We haven't.
Well,
not UE4.
No, my team's actually done some development for Gear VR using Carmack's native stuff, and I'm actually not sure what's going on under the hood there. But that's actually a lot of where the habit to pre-render actually came from.
Oh, okay. Thanks.
Yeah.
Oh, that is bright. I was just wondering if all of the demos were made in UE4.
That's right, they all were.
Okay, and just why did you make the decision to go with UE4, especially given that they don't have any forward rendering?
That's a good question. I think the strongest reason is that basically the whole team was put together of sort of game industry people. And this is maybe a simplification, but I think broadly speaking, UE4 is built by professional developers for professional developers more so than Unity. I think Unity is catching up with Unity 5, but Unity 5 was still sort of in development back then. And so we just sort of chose to go all in. And once we kind of invested in developing UE4 expertise, it sort of made sense to stick with it. And we have a really good relationship with Epic. But I think, honestly, there's no off-the-shelf engine right now with the sort of scale of either Unity or UE4 that is ideal for VR. So in either case, you end up having to probably either accept what they provide you or rewrite parts of it. And at least with UE4, you have the full source code, so you can dive in if you have the aptitude and the willingness. So, cool.
You'd mentioned a couple things about specifically particles and presence versus comfort. You'd mentioned, bubbles are like lots of things all moving in a uniform direction, gave bad optical flow.
Yep.
But you'd also said that dust motes and sort of near field particles were really good.
Generally, I'm sorry to interrupt. Generally, when we're doing those kind of things, they're static, or they have multiple directions, or they're so subtle that you're anchored. In scenarios where, like the underwater path, if you were standing there and a large bunch of fish went by, suddenly you might feel like you're doing this. It kind of, if you've ever been in like a slow, gentle snowfall and you just stand there, you'll slowly start to feel like you're rising in real life. And so some of that certainly happens in VR.
Thank you.
Welcome.
How did you do the mirror in the self demo? Because UE4 has terrible mirrors.
Yeah, I wonder if you can guess if I say that it's a terrible hack.
So how?
Copy and paste the room.
Manually copy and pasting the room. So.
Fair enough, thanks.
Yeah, unfortunately there's nothing else going on. I would say with a lot of the stuff we did, there was, if you can think of the dumbest way of doing it, that's what we had to do just because of time constraints. So
there's a lot of developer tomfoolery is happening.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I was wondering how many levels of detail you created for Wanda?
She actually has no LODs at all. We managed to get everything sort of locked down that she was performing at 40K.
But you built her in ZBrush at like very high fidelity, and then just kind of broke her down to a lower topology. Right.
Yep.
So in some sense, like you modeled at like 30 million or something, and then.
No, 9 million. I
yeah.
think
So 9 million, but then there was only one in-engine version at like 30 or 40K, right?
And we had a first round where it was actually like conservative game developer. The first thing I did was like bring it down to like 14,000, which is kind of super sub of what's sort of next gen these days. And she looked okay, but she got really close. You could definitely see a lot of triangles and some deformation errors, and handed it off to a gentleman who was much better than I am at topology, and he fixed it.
All right. Is that all, or is there anyone else who wants to ask a question?
Cool. Well, hey, appreciate you guys taking the time.
Thanks a lot
Cool,
for coming.
Thank you.